good evening, or perhaps good night, wherever you are listening from. Welcome to Lullaby Murders, soothing bedtime crimes. This is a quiet place for true stories told carefully. Stories that unfolded in ordinary settings, shared slowly and with intention, allowing space for understanding rather than shock. Each episode explores a real criminal case in a calm, measured way. There are no sudden sounds here, no raised voices, no unnecessary intensity. The details are real, and they are not softened, but they are handled gently, with respect for the people at the center of the story. You can listen closely, or you can let the words drift in the background. Either way is fine. Tonight's story comes from a small town in the American Midwest. It is a story about familiarity, trust, and an ordinary afternoon that slowly, quietly became something else. When you're ready, we'll begin. Delphi, Indiana, is the kind of place where life moves at a steady pace. It is not a town built for hurry. Roads curve gently. Neighborhoods feel settled rather than dense. Houses are spaced in a way that allows people to feel close, but not crowded. Many of the families who live there have been in the area for generations. People recognize one another, even if they don't always know names. Faces become familiar through repetition rather than introduction. Delphi has fewer than 3,000 residents. That size shapes everything about it. There are routines that repeat daily. The same shops, the same petrol stations, the same school buildings and sports fields. Places become familiar not because they are remarkable, but because they are dependable. In winter, that sense of familiarity becomes quieter. Trees lose their leaves and stand bare against the sky, their branches thin and dark. The landscape simplifies. Fields turn flat and muted. Sound carries further in the cold air. By early February, winter has usually settled in fully. Days are short. Morning light arrives slowly, often filtered through cloud. Afternoons fade early, the sun slipping away well before evening routines are finished. February 13th, 2017 was a Monday. It was not marked by any unusual event. Schools were operating on modified schedules, and many students were home for the day. For adults, it was a regular workday. Parents left for work. Errands were run. Lunch was eaten. Time moved forward in the quiet, unnoticed way it often does. For two girls in Delphi, the day felt open. Abigail Williams was 13 years old. She was known to everyone as Abby. Abby had a gentle presence. She was not loud by nature, but people were drawn to her easily. She smiled often, and when she listened, she did so fully. She enjoyed sports, particularly volleyball. More recently, she had started playing softball as well, partly because she liked it, and partly because it gave her more time with her best friend. That friend was Liberty German. Libby was 14. She was slightly taller than Abby, with an expressive face and an energetic way of moving through the world. She liked photography and video. She noticed small details and liked capturing them on her phone, moments that felt ordinary at the time, but somehow worth keeping. She posted these clips and photos online, the way many teenagers do, without much thought beyond the moment itself. Libby was confident, talkative, and curious. Where Abby was steady and calm, Libby brought momentum. Together, they fit easily. Their friendship did not require effort. They were comfortable in silence, but they also laughed easily. They trusted one another completely. That afternoon, they asked for a ride to a local trail. It was not a dramatic request. They had been there before. The area was familiar, well known to people in the community. The trail system near the Monon High Bridge was a place locals had grown up around. Parents had walked there when they were young. It did not carry the reputation of danger. The Monon High Bridge itself had been built decades earlier, when railroads still shaped much of the landscape. It was no longer in use for trains, but it remained standing. The bridge stretched across open space, high above the ground below. Its wooden planks were weathered, uneven, and marked by years of exposure to wind, rain, and snow. Walking across, it required attention. There were visible gaps between the planks. The height was noticeable, but it was also familiar. People visited for the quiet, for the view, for the feeling of being briefly removed from the world below. When Abby and Libby arrived that afternoon, the environment felt calm. The air was cold, but not unbearable. Their breath appeared briefly as they spoke, then vanished again. The trees were still. There was no wind strong enough to move branches. The world felt paused in that particular way winter afternoons sometimes do. They walked together, talking softly. There was no urgency to their pace. They stopped now and then, looking out over the landscape, then continued on. It was the kind of afternoon that feels unremarkable while it's happening. Libby carried her phone, as she often did. She recorded small moments without much thought. Photos of friends, short videos of places and people. At one point, she took a photo of Abby walking ahead of her on the bridge. The image was simple. Abby bundled against the cold, framed by bare branches and pale sky. Libby posted the photo online. It was not meant to document anything important. It was simply a moment. As they continued their walk, Libby raised her phone again. She recorded a short video. It lasted only a few seconds. Behind them on the bridge, a man was walking in the same direction. His appearance was unremarkable. He wore a jacket, jeans, clothing that blended easily into the setting. There was nothing about him that immediately drew attention. His posture was relaxed, his pace steady. The image itself was ordinary. Then there was sound, footsteps on wood, and a voice. The words were brief and direct. Guys down the hill. They were not shouted. They were not frantic. They were spoken with firmness. The phone was lowered. At that moment, it may not have registered as dangerous. It may have felt uncomfortable or confusing or simply strange. Sometimes recognition comes later. As the afternoon moved forward, time continued to pass elsewhere in Delphi. Parents finished work. People began thinking about dinner. Lights switched on as daylight faded. When Abby and Libby did not return home at the expected time, concern began quietly. At first, it was mild. A glance at the clock, a thought that they might be running late, an assumption that they were still nearby. Messages were sent, calls were made. When there was no response, the concern sharpened. Parents drove familiar roads, scanning sidewalks and parking areas. Every passing minute carried the hope that the girls would appear, unaware of the worry growing around them. As evening settled in, the temperature dropped further. Darkness arrived fully. Search efforts began. Family members, friends, neighbors gathered near the trail. Flashlights were pulled from cars. Jackets zipped higher against the cold. Cars lined the roads. Names were called into the dark, softly at first, then louder. Waiting at night feels different. Sound travels unpredictably. Shadows stretch and blur. The mind fills the silence too easily. People searched carefully, holding onto the belief that this was a misunderstanding, that the girls were delayed, that they would be found soon. Hours passed. The search continued into the night, then into the early hours of morning. By the time daylight returned, the tone had shifted. Authorities became involved. The search expanded. What began as concern had become something heavier. Morning arrived slowly over Delphi. The light was pale and cold, filtering through bare branches and low clouds. The temperature had dropped further overnight, leaving frost clinging to the ground. For those who had searched through the night, exhaustion settled in quietly. Movement slowed. Voices softened. What had begun as a search driven by hope now carried a different weight. Law enforcement officers expanded the search area. Procedures shifted from informal searching to coordinated effort. Shortly after midday, on February 14th, the girls were found. Their bodies were located in a wooded area not far from the trail system. The distance was close enough to feel unsettling. They had not been far from where people were searching. The confirmation brought an immediate stillness. For the families, the moment marked a break in reality. Hope did not fade gently. It ended abruptly. The deaths of Abigail Williams and Liberty German were ruled homicides. The injuries were severe and fatal. The nature of the crime made it clear that this was not an accident. The violence was intentional. Authorities did not release explicit details publicly. They spoke carefully, choosing words that conveyed seriousness without description. What was known, and what would later be confirmed in court, was that the girls had been attacked and killed. Their deaths were the result of deliberate actions taken against them. The investigation began immediately. The area was secured. Evidence was collected methodically. Paths were traced. Timelines reconstructed. Investigators worked with the understanding that time mattered. The Monon High Bridge Trail, once familiar and casual, became the center of intense focus. Officers spoke with anyone who had been in the area that afternoon. Witnesses were asked about vehicles, about people, about anything that might have felt out of place. In the days that followed, the town of Delphi changed. People moved more quietly. Conversations lowered in volume. Ordinary routines felt fragile. Parents watched their children more closely. Familiar places carried a new sense of awareness. The trail system was no longer just a place to walk. Within the investigation, one detail stood out almost immediately. Libby's phone. Despite the violence of the crime, Libby had managed to record a short video and audio clip. It was only a few seconds long, but it mattered. The video showed the man walking behind the girls on the bridge. The audio captured his voice. Those few seconds became central to the case. Investigators handled the material carefully. They did not release it all at once. When the first image was made public, it was a still frame taken from the video. It showed a man mid-step on the bridge. His clothing appeared ordinary. A jacket, jeans, a hat. There was nothing distinctive enough to immediately identify him. And yet, the image was unsettling in its simplicity. People studied it closely. They examined his posture, the way his hands rested, the angle of his shoulders. The audio was released later. 4 words: "Guys down the hill." The tone of the voice drew attention. It was calm, firm, controlled. People listened repeatedly, trying to hear something that might stand out. An accent, a cadence, anything familiar. The public response was immediate and intense. The image and audio circulated widely. News outlets replayed them. Online communities formed around the case. People wanted answers. They wanted certainty, but certainty did not come easily. Investigators released sketches based on witness descriptions. The first sketch depicted an older man, heavier in appearance. Later, a second sketch was released, showing a much younger-looking individual. The contrast between the two images created confusion. People questioned how the same person could be represented so differently. The revisions led to speculation. Some believed the wrong person had been depicted initially. Others wondered if witnesses had seen different individuals. Online discussion grew louder. The case became a topic of constant conversation far beyond Delphi. For the families, this attention brought mixed feelings. On one hand, it kept the case alive. On the other, it invited speculation that often crossed lines. Names were shared. Rumors spread. Innocent people found themselves scrutinized. Lives were disrupted by suspicion Without evidence, law enforcement urged patience. They emphasized that the investigation was ongoing, that information was being verified carefully, that conclusions would not be rushed. Time passed. Weeks turned into months, months into years. The case remained unresolved. For the families of Abby and Libby, grief settled into daily life. It did not move in a straight line. Some days felt manageable. Others felt heavy beyond measure. Birthdays arrived without celebration. Holidays carried a different weight. Life continued around them, but absence remained constant. In Delphi, familiarity became complicated. People still walked the trails, but not without memory, not without thought. The idea that someone could commit such a crime and remain unidentified weighed heavily on the community. Investigators continued their work quietly. Tips were followed, evidence re-examined, technology advanced. Years passed. Winter returned again and again, each time echoing the season when everything had changed. Then, in October of 2022, the investigation shifted. An arrest was made. Richard Allen, a local man, was taken into custody. He lived in Delphi. He worked nearby. He had moved through everyday life without drawing attention. The announcement sent shock through the community. The idea that someone so close, so ordinary, could be connected to the crime was difficult to process. The legal process began. Details emerged slowly. Allen was charged with the murders of Abby and Libby. As the case moved toward trial, the weight of the years became apparent. Evidence that had been collected long ago was brought forward again. Timelines were carefully reconstructed. The trial unfolded without spectacle. There was no rush. Testimony was measured. Facts were presented deliberately. The recorded video and audio were addressed again. This time, within a broader context, what had once felt like fragments began to align. The verdict eventually came. Richard Allen was convicted. The sentence was long. For some, the conviction brought a sense of relief. For others, it raised questions that would take time to settle. Justice did not arrive with celebration. It arrived quietly. For the families, it marked the end of waiting, but not the end of grief. Grief does not disappear with answers. It changes shape. For Delphi, the arrest and conviction marked a shift, not a closure. The story did not end. It softened. Trails remained. The bridge still stood. Memory lingered in those spaces, quietly and persistently. In the weeks following the conviction, Delphi moved forward carefully. There was no sudden sense of relief that settled over the town. No sharp turning point where everything felt resolved. Instead, there was a quiet adjustment. People spoke less about the case in public spaces, not because it no longer mattered, but because it had taken on a different shape. For years, the story had existed as an open question, a space filled with uncertainty, speculation, and waiting. Now that space was closed, but closure does not erase what came before it. For the families of Abigail Williams and Liberty German, the verdict marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. They no longer waited for answers, but grief remained. Grief does not respond to timelines or outcomes. It does not recede simply because justice has been served. It lives quietly alongside ordinary life. Days continued to pass. Mornings arrived. Evenings settled in. For the families, the absence of Abby and Libby remained constant. Their names were no longer only associated with a case. They were remembered as daughters, as friends, as young people whose lives had been interrupted abruptly. The trial had required them to revisit moments they had lived with privately for years, listening to details spoken aloud, hearing timelines reconstructed. That process required a different kind of strength. Outside the courtroom, the world continued. Cars passed through town. Shops opened and closed. Seasons shifted again. The contrast between public process and private grief was difficult to reconcile. In Delphi, familiar places carried layered meaning. The trail system still existed. The bridge still stood. People continued to walk there, though often with more awareness. Memory does not announce itself loudly. It settles in quietly. It appears in small pauses, in glances toward certain paths, in moments of hesitation. For many, the case left a lasting awareness of how quickly ordinary moments can change. An afternoon walk, a familiar place, a routine request. Nothing about that day announced what it would become. That is part of what makes stories like this difficult to carry. They do not unfold in obvious ways. They do not arrive with warning. For those who followed the case from a distance, the conviction brought a sense of resolution. Questions that had lingered for years were answered. But even from afar, the weight of the story remained. It became less about curiosity and more about remembrance. Abby and Libby were not characters in a narrative. They were real people. They had interests, friendships, plans that extended beyond that winter afternoon. They trusted familiar places. They trusted the world they had grown up in. Libby's decision to record those few seconds mattered deeply. It was not dramatic. It was instinctive. A simple action taken in an uncertain moment. Those seconds carried forward when nothing else could. They gave investigators something solid to work with. They provided direction in a case filled with unknowns. But the presence of friendship mattered too. Abby and Libby were together. They were not isolated. They were not alone. They shared the same space, the same moment. That matters. As years continue to pass, the story settles further into the background of collective memory. It is no longer a constant headline. It no longer dominates conversation. But remembrance does not require constant attention. It exists quietly. It lives in the way communities hold shared history, in the way parents watch their children a little more closely, in the way familiar places carry invisible layers of meaning. For some listeners, this story may feel heavy. For others, it may feel distant. If you are listening now, there is nothing you need to take with you beyond this moment. You do not need to hold onto timelines or details. You do not need to remember names or dates. The story has taken the space it needs. It can settle. The world outside continues its steady movement. Morning will come. Light will return. Ordinary life will resume, as it always does. For now, there is only stillness, breath moving gently in and out, thoughts loosening their grip, awareness softening. You can allow the story to fade now. Nothing further is required. Rest can arrive in its own time. Good night.